皆様ご視聴いただきありがとうございます。ただいまより笹川平和財団主催
watching.
SPF China Observer
We will begin SPF China Observer online open forum. Thank you very much for joining SPF China Observer online open forum. The topic today is challenges for China posed by the Ukraine war. On July 26, Professor Ichiro Inoue, professor of Kwansei Gakuin University, contributed a paper, and that paper will be the basis of today's forum. As speaker, we have Professor Inoue of Kwansei Gakuin University, and as discussant, we have Professor Akio Takahara of Tokyo University, and I, Bonji Ohara from Sasakawa Peace Foundation, have the honor of serving as moderator. I'm sure the audience has many questions on the topic today, and in YouTube chat section, we are accepting questions throughout the presentation as well as panel discussion. Please send your question with your name, and later we would like to take up your questions during the panel discussion. On February 24, President Putin began invasion of Ukraine, and since then, there are similarities and differences between Ukraine and Taiwan that have been discussed. And Ukraine invasion, how it affects the Taiwan unification issue, had been discussed. And in order to pursue this discussion, what China is learning from the lesson of Ukraine war is what we have to think about. And therefore, today, we have Professor Inoue, who wrote an article on this. And with Professor Takahara, we would like to have in-depth discussion. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Inoue to give his lecture.
Yes, thank you very much. As introduced, I am professor of Kwansei Gakuin University. My name is Ichiro Inoue. Challenges posed to China by the Ukraine conflict is the theme of my speech. Could you upload the PowerPoint, please? Then I'd like to start my talk. First of all, on this issue, already there has been a considerable amount of discussion. And I wrote this paper in July when it was before Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan. And the situation regarding Taiwan has become increasingly strained thereafter. And there has been a lot of talk about the Taiwan emergency. And the Taiwan emergency discussion and China unilaterally invading Taiwan, that's a different point. So as I will be explaining later, the Ukraine dispute posed some challenges to China. China saw this weak Russia and was shocked. The Taiwanese issue and the Taiwan integration issue is such that China needs to digest the way Russia fought in Ukraine. Can you turn to the next PowerPoint? Ukrainian conflict and China's foreign and domestic policy. Before we talk about integration of Taiwan, the Ukraine conflict, how that impacts China's foreign and domestic policy is what I'd like to address. As mentioned earlier, on the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine. On the 4th of February, the China-Russia joint statement was issued. Putin went to Beijing, and they said that there was no limitation to the relationship of the two countries. To the Western media, well, this was taken up by the Western media, and having said that, to the eyes of China, the relationship between Europe and the United States has to be balanced with that of Russia, because in terms of trade, it has a much larger relationship with the Western countries and the United States. Of course, strategically, Russia is very important. With regard to relationships with the United States, a stable relationship is something that China tried to explore. China-U.S. relations after the Trump administration has deteriorated, and the Biden administration continues to show a very tough stance. On the other hand, steadfast efforts for dialogue continues. Biden and Xi Jinping talked in July, and this is the 5th round of talks. And Austin, Secretary of Defense, and Ichiro had a talk together at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and they condemned each other. But they do have a dialogue, and Sullivan also and Zhang Jiechi also had talks, and Blinken and Wang Yi, foreign minister, also had a talk. Following on July, they had a talk in September. So to the eyes of China, in terms of words, it seems that they are in confrontation. But they have a stable relationship. The undercurrents are stable, and a predictable relationship is what they are looking for in relationships with the United States, as China is that way at all times. They want to divide China and the United States. China and EU online summit meeting took place, and Xi Jinping at the time said Europe has its own thinking, and Europe should pursue its own independent thinking. It seems that has been conveyed. And High Representative Borrell said that we stand together with Ukraine on this issue, not because we are a proxy of the United States. And he said that China is perhaps misunderstanding. That was what was communicated later on. And how does China see the overall international situation and the landscape? The Ukraine conflict, how that changes international politics is a very important point. For the moment, the Chinese perception has not largely changed, it seems. That is, the United States power is in the long term waning, and China is increasing its power, and especially China through influence of developing countries is expanding or can expand its influence. That is what China thinks. And very actively, Asia diplomacy has been developed in the first half of this year. There's a BRICS summit meeting in September. There was the SCO meeting, Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. And after COVID, Xi Jinping went overseas for the first time for this event. And AUKUS and Quad, the Asia version of NATO, is something that they are very wary of. So moving to the next slide. To the eyes of China, and we need to look at domestic politics. In the 8 years of Xi Jinping rule, this year is the worst year, it seems, especially in terms of the economy. And shortly, there'll be the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. It's a very sensitive year, and the economy is very bad at this moment. For Xi Jinping, there's a lot of anxiety on his part. Of course, Xi Jinping, as is often said, wants to increase his power base. And Xi Jinping's interests and China's interests are not necessarily aligned at all times. Especially relations with the United States, the relationship has deteriorated too much. And so within China, there are a lot of views. Jiang Zemin, the faction, feels that they have obtained benefits because the relationship with the United States was favorable. But then there is, on the other hand, nationalism, anti-U.S. sentiment. The relationship with the United States is a very difficult issue. And that is when the Ukraine conflict occurred. And for example, Lee Young-chung, this is the chief deputy foreign minister, at one time was said to be the successor of Wang Yi, but the majority view is that towing the lines of Xi Jinping, he advanced relationship with Russia, and then the Ukraine conflict occurred, and he was made to take responsibility for this. There is such an interpretation. This often happens in China. The bureaucrats are excessively keen on meeting superiors' wishes, and that occurs frequently in China. And the Taiwan integration issue and the Ukraine conflict on this issue. The basic stance of China is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's unification of Taiwan scenario, whether there has been a change in unification of the Taiwan scenario has not been confirmed. The U.S. intelligence agency, Burns, director of intelligence, said that Russia's early struggles in Ukraine make China wary of using force against Taiwan. That's and Haynes, director of national intelligence, also says this, as well as CIA director Burns. And this war this time has not ended, and we don't know what the outcome will be in the end. But lessons, if China would learn lessons from this in military operations, it needs to digest all the information that was given to it. Taiwan unification is not only a military issue, there's a political issue, a broader political issue. So regardless of the time it requires, even when Russia struggles, there's no change in China's determination to reunify, and it cannot change its economic policy. That is the Taiwan unification issue. Is a military economic rationality. It exceeds that. It's the very policy of the Chinese administration which is involved here. The Taiwan landing operation, if there's a prospect that they will succeed, it might make a decision, but that is not the only factor. And very simply put, this is a very political issue. So even if militarily disadvantageous, Taiwan reunification, if there's a ruling out of the ruling out of the possibility of that, they could take military action. On the other hand, what we need to be aware of is that regardless of the Ukraine conflict, the military relationship and the relationship with Taiwan will loom very much larger. And if that is the case, immediate exertion of military power is not something that discussions will lead to at the moment. The next slide, please. The Ukraine conflict, lessons for the Ukraine conflict and the issue of Taiwan reunification and the relationship between the two. Looking at the recent China-U.S. relations and the U.S.-Taiwanese relationship, to the eyes of China, the changing of the status quo, they say, is done by the United States. That is how China sees it. The United States is changing the status quo. Sailing of U.S. Navy vessels through the Taiwan Strait, that occurs regularly. And the Taiwan Strait is open sea. And so naval vessels are free to navigate. And there's no issue with that. But up until now, the United States military had exercised self-restraint with regard to navigation. After the Trump administration, however, this has become a daily event. So China sees this as a change in attitude by the United States. And the Chinese side is most concerned about the Taiwanese authorities and the expansion of U.S. government official interaction with the Chinese authorities. If in substance they support the Taiwanese authorities, and they have done that, and they've continued exchanges, and the U.S. Congress has enacted legislation. The United States government said that it has no change in one China policy, but in substance it has changed the way it deals with Taiwan. That is, United States self-restraint or tacit understanding, as China would probably call it, is being reduced to mere form. It's being undermined gradually. And so from the domestic eyes of China, the military and the rightists are increasing their dissatisfaction. And the U.S. China is very concerned about the Taiwan issue from that standpoint. So, as seen from the United States, what is the Sino-Taiwanese relationship? After the Xi Jinping government came into being, there was a hardline foreign stance, including Hong Kong, and military power has been exercised in a larger way. And so there is some caution, and Taiwan as a mature democracy and trust in the Tsai Ing-wen government and sympathy toward the government is there. And the Taiwan Strait issue, from the eyes of the United States, they have to increase deterrence. As you know, President Biden many times said that the United States would protect Taiwan, and the ambiguous strategy of ambiguity. What to do about that? A high official in the United States said clearly that Taiwan should be protected and abandoning the ambiguity strategy. So in substance, Taiwan has to be supported and has to be protected, and deterrence has to be increased, and that awareness is increasing to the eyes of China. For Taiwan unification or to invade Taiwan is different from Russia invading Ukraine. It's United States intervention has to be assumed on the part of China. Next slide, please.
So lessons for China from Ukraine war in its efforts to unify Taiwan. What is often said is in military aspect. First of all, in Ukraine conflict, the Russian tanks crossed borders and invaded the neighbor, but unlike that, there will have to be landing operation across Taiwan Strait, and military operation will be more complex and there will be associated risks. I'm sure this is also already taken into account by PLA Navy. And however, militarily, it is not as easy to invade in comparison to Ukraine. And for China, military victory, decisive military victory over short term is necessary. But Russia is struggling right now. Russian military is very weak. And for China, I'm sure this came as a huge shock. On the other hand, short-term decisive military victory, even if that were possible, China has looked at many wars and conflicts that U.S. fought and has learned from that. Recently, in Iraq and Afghanistan, China has looked at lessons from those wars. Rather than short-term military victory, long-term occupation and maintaining long-term occupation and associated difficulties and risks, I believe, are understood by China, or China has to think about these difficulties. And militarily, the U.S., and I think also that is true for UK, but U.S.-UK intelligence community have shown that they have superb capabilities. I think that is another lesson that China learned. And Ukraine conflict may be different, but in case of Taiwan, but what types of weapons are provided by the West? I'm sure China has looked at that closely as well. In the meantime, supposing if Taiwan were to be occupied by China, if supplies were to be provided to Taiwan by outside, in case of Ukraine, from the western side, NATO and the U.S. are able to provide supplies to Ukraine using land route. But in case of island Taiwan, providing supplies will be more difficult. From Ukraine conflict, I think that is another lesson that China has learned. for nuclear power to be a party to a conflict. In such a conflict, well, in case of a current Ukraine war, that is Russia, and when nuclear power is the party involved, the United States will have to be cautious in intervening. President Biden quite early on warned of possible World War III, and China so far, when it comes to nuclear weapons, it used to be that it was said that China had, for defensive purposes, nuclear weapons, but according to US think tanks these days, at a quicker pace than before, China is strengthening its nuclear capabilities. And it is likely that looking at the response of the US this time, I believe China has come to be convinced of the importance of nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. In economic aspect, what are the lessons China learned from Ukraine war that can be applied to its efforts to unify Taiwan? The West was quite swift and thorough in imposing sanctions on Russia. And I think this came as a shock for China, but China has learned from this, I'm sure, from this. Financial sanctions, trade restrictions, and freezing of assets of senior government officials. These measures were taken by the West. And if in the future, if these measures are imposed on China, how China can counter these measures, inclusive of that, I'm sure China is considering. And on a larger scale, in terms of economy, after the escalation of the tensions between the United States and China, China is adopting economic strategy of dual circulation. The two concepts separate the external demand and domestic demand. And if China is too dependent on external demand, it will have negative impact on itself. And the dual circulation economic strategy, I believe, is reaffirmed after Ukraine war. And I believe China will be strengthening domestic supply chain and expand domestic demand. Same from China, major trading partners are first the United States, Japan, Germany, and South Korea. And all are the US or allies of the United States. For these countries, same from these Western countries, the biggest trading partner is China. And there is the discussion of economic security. However, complete decoupling will be difficult. On the other hand, if China were to make military invasion on Taiwan unilaterally, and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what happened was the unity of international community. But after, if China were to invade Taiwan, what would be the strength of unity of international community? Regarding a Russian invasion, including India, some of the major developing countries did not join in the UN resolution condemning Russia. And Taiwan, for most countries, there's no formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And to what extent, in particular, Asian neighbors can be unified? That is an issue. And Dr. Michael Green, a Japan expert, who used to be at CSIS, said, I think in May this year, and the former Joint Chief of Staff Admiral Mullen visited Taiwan as a non-governmental delegation, and I understand that Dr. Green also was a member of the delegation. And later, he said that, same from Taiwan, by far, in terms of defending Taiwan, the United States is very important, about 80%, and next comes Japan at about 15%. Militarily, what Japan can do is very limited. And the nuance is that, however, there is also remaining 5%. It may be Australia, Canada, or European countries and international communities support to Taiwan. The interest of the West in Taiwan is also important. But in respect to Taiwan, by far the US is very important, and there is an issue of to what extent other countries can be united. Next, visit by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan. In that respect, Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker's visit to Taiwan, naturally heightened short-term tensions. In China, domestically, when we look at public opinion online, there's a fierce reaction asking for tougher stance by the government. And there is also a pressure on the military in China over short term. Vis-a-vis the US, China will have to take a strong stance in view of domestic public opinion. And therefore, what is not tolerable has to be indicated in view of rising tension between US and China. China's side has the red line perception, and red line has to be shown more clearly to the United States from the perspective of China. And if there's a deeper relations with Taiwan, there will be a limit to that, and that red line had to be indicated by Taiwan. However, over medium to long term, China would like to avoid escalating tensions between the US. Even if it may be completely stable, but China would like to enjoy undercurrent of stable relationship. But there is a strong reaction against Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And as you know, China will be applying pressure to Taiwan as a result. As you know, China has increased its military activities surrounding Taiwan after the visit. At the time when Speaker Pelosi visited, it was in the beginning of August, right before the Beidai meeting and before the 20th Congress of Communist Party. So it was a sensitive time that the visit was made, and over short term, China had to show a tough stance. And at the same time, as short term need to show tough position. So far, the exchange between the U.S. and Taiwan, that framework is now becoming more and more a fait accompli. And this is my last slide, anxieties of Xi Jinping and policy decisions by Xi Jinping. As I have described thus far, recently there's much debate about the Taiwan contingency in many quarters, and certainly tensions are high. And accidentally, something may occur, or as shown here, there may be some misperception, mutually misperception, and erroneous judgment by Xi Jinping. And through these, it's possible that escalation may further increase. However, if we apply rational thoughts, under the current circumstances, for China to unilaterally invade Taiwan is unrealistic. During the Ukraine conflict, how Russia is fighting is offering lesson for China. When Ukraine war broke out, some worried that it may induce China to invade Taiwan, but Director of CIA Burns, as it was mentioned by Mr. Burns, I think China was made to reconsider its military operation associated with the invasion of Taiwan. China is having to absorb and learn the situation. This year, for Xi Jinping administration, it is said that this is the worst year. There are numerous challenges, and Taiwan invasion will decide the fate of the administration. It is the most grave decision and cannot be made casually. Xi Jinping cannot afford to gamble on this. Having said so, policy-making authority is more and more concentrated in Xi Jinping. After Xi Jinping administration came into being, it said top-level design policy-making is practiced. And high-ranking bureaucrats, senior government officials are focused on the supreme leader, conscious only of supreme leader, and there's less check on Xi Jinping's decision-making. That is the impression I can't help but have. From the bureaucrat, information is communicated to the senior leaders, and since before, intelligence information, it was said that in China, only biased information may have been conveyed to the top leaders, according to Western scholars. And I believe that recently it has become even more difficult to exercise check on Xi Jinping's decision-making. So if Xi Jinping makes erroneous policy decision, how can that be checked? CCP has concentration of power, and the government bureaucrats' opinions, how can that be cleverly conveyed to be reflected in policies, even if it goes against the top leaders' thinking? That leads to political instability, and it looks right now Xi Jinping will begin the third term as the leader, but this can be potentially source of instability. Professor Inoue, thank you very much. If we apply rational thoughts right now, China has to make a long-term investment, including building of global governance, and immediate invasion of Taiwan may not be in its thought currently, but Taiwan unification is a matter that affects the legitimacy of CCP's rule. So rational thinking alone may not explain everything, and including military invasion of Taiwan by China, major factors involved in possible unification of Taiwan is the United States. And between the US and China, perceptions are totally different, according to Professor Inoue. And in order to understand China's policy on Taiwan, we also have to understand China's domestic politics and foreign diplomacy. These have been discussed quite often, but Professor Takahara, how was your comment?
Thank you very much, Professor Inoue. With regard to invasion into Ukraine and how China is responding, if we look at that issue alone, it's a very large issue in its own right. But reunification with Taiwan and what impact that would have makes it increasingly complex. So on this issue, a very thorough explanation is given looking at the different angles. And I believe that was the nature of his presentation. So on my part, I would like to raise a few questions. There is very little time remaining. One question is to get back to the very basic issue, the Taiwan reunification issue, and what impact the Ukraine invasion has. In thinking about this, what a basic issue related to this is, had there been none of this, the Chinese Communist Party's reunification scenario, what was the scenario to start with? Perhaps we should get that straight. And this reunification scenario, what impact did the invasion into Ukraine have? Then to think about this issue, and I think we should think about things in that order. So recently, looking at the different trends, especially a confrontation between U.S. and China, the focal issue was Taiwan. And so basically, what was the stance is perhaps something that I would like to ask Professor Inoue to explain. That's the first issue. And secondly, this is also a very basic issue once again. The invasion into Ukraine. The challenges that this poses to China. That is the title of the talk today. There are different challenges that was posed. Russia is quite reckless, and China entered into a partnership with this reckless Russia. And what to do about this would be a very major challenge for China. That is what I think. And the United States strategic competition. China has to win out in this, and China as well as Russia thinks that, and so they feel that they're the two most important partners, and the joint statement was a very lengthy one to this effect. But from the eyes of China, Russia invading Ukraine, and there is this quagmire of war, and China feels that it's a sticky issue that Russia has given rise to. Of course, a partnership with Russia and the merits that it brings about. There are merits and there are demerits as well, which has become elucidated. So what to do is the issue. Revision of relations with Russia. Will China do that or not? That's the second issue. And if there is a revision, naturally, U.S.-China relations, China's policy vis-a-vis the United States will be inevitably impacted. So how do you view the possibility of this happening? This is my second question. And this is my last question, my third question. And as Mr. Bonji summarized, domestic politics and how that fits in, the Xi Jinping's top-level design is there, naturally. But in spite of this, with regard to the Ukraine invasion, especially between March and May, those that are in the very inner circles of the political regime have objected, and that has become clear. Whether the present situation is satisfactory. Russia is no longer a country that we should be relating to. That is the kind of view that came out from within the inner circles of the political administration. On the 15th of June, Putin and Xi Jinping had a telephone conference, and Xi Jinping Xi Jinping said something to the effect that it accepts Russia's behavior. And then nothing surfaced after that. On the 15th of September, in Samarkand, as you mentioned, there was the SCO summit meeting, and Putin had a direct meeting with Xi Jinping, and the atmosphere so long as it's reported, seems that the atmosphere was pretty tough. Both had a severe look on their faces. Putin looked as if he was really giving a stare at Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping said, Putin said, with regard to questions and concerns about the Ukraine invasion, I understand. That is what Putin apparently said. And China's attitude toward the Ukraine issue perhaps has changed, and perhaps we could understand it that way. And if that is the case, as to why this is the case, that's perhaps has some relationship with the domestic political scene in China. If you have thoughts on this, I'd like to hear about it, please. That is all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Inoue, please. Thank you, Professor Takahara, for your comments. All of your questions cannot be answered in clear-cut answers. First, regarding the scenario of Taiwan unification, what would have been the scenario had there been no Ukraine invasion? Taiwan contingency is much talked about these days, and it sounds as though China is ready to invade Taiwan unilaterally, and there is a strong concern for that. In the security, when it comes to national security, of course, we have to assume the worst and has to make preparations for worst. So Chinese unilateral invasion of Taiwan, that alone doesn't constitute a Taiwan contingency, but we have to assume the worst case scenario and make preparations for that. That may be done in a low profile fashion or may be done intentionally so that China will be aware of that. And similarly, for example, how to evacuate Japanese living in Taiwan, such preparations are very important. On the other hand, the unification scenario of Taiwan for China, military invasion, it is not only simply a military invasion and military unification of Taiwan. I think still peaceful unification is the basic policy of China. And peaceful unification may sound nice in words, but Chinese national power is strengthening, and the U.S. power is on the decline, especially in this region. Against this backdrop, for Taiwan, Taiwan will have to be absorbed in the sphere of influence of China. There's that pressure, and voluntarily, and I'm not sure if this can be called voluntarily, but Taiwan may be going under the umbrella of China. So I don't think military invasion is the first priority of China. And regarding Taiwan Strait, tension is increased. But I think even today, basic thinking of China remains unchanged, that military invasion is not the top priority. Regarding the second and the third questions, it's also difficult to address in clear-cut fashion.
Both, I think, are related. Partnership with Russia, what to do about this partnership. And perhaps they have made their relationship too rich with Russia, too thick with Russia. And on the part of China, to balance things out is what they have to do. And that is what China feels, I believe. In relations with the United States, Russia strategically is very important. That is the kind of existence Russia is. On the other hand, inclusive of the United States, Western countries feels this relationship is a very big relationship, and there is no outcome which is clear regard to this war. On the international society, how this issue will be dealt with is something that we do not know. To a certain degree, China, as to how it is treated internationally, it tries to exert influence through SCO and so forth. But at the present point in time, I don't think China has drawn a conclusion as to what it wants to do. But initially, what was on the minds of China in terms of relations with Russia, as mentioned earlier, on the 4th of February, they talked about mutual relations as having no limits. And perhaps China thinks it went too far in saying that. In the end, what is important for China? It's the national interest on the part of China that's important. And so the international landscape is still changing. And for China, what is China's national interest? What is the best option for China? I think China is still thinking about this. It's running and thinking at the same time. I think that is the situation that China finds itself in. And on the domestic scene, the kind of discussions which are taking place as to what the atmosphere there is in China, I have no confidence about this. It's hard to see. There were opposition views domestically, and a person in the government, the Chinese government, that has aired opposition to the present stance of the government. But my feeling is that the kind of people that I know, the researchers of international politics in China, the kind of people I know, exercise common sense, and they say with regard to the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, I would imagine that they're negative about this. On the other hand, there's this nationalism, but separate from that, I believe that is the stance. On the other hand, recently the September SCO meeting, within that framework, in the future, should the Russia-Ukraine conflict turn out such that, although it's not clear at the moment, if this conflict pans out in a way that China intervenes or arbitrates, and if it arbitrates, it will be evaluated highly internationally. If that is conceivable, the SCO members or the SCO forum would become very important. At the present point in time, the Ukraine conflict, China acting as a mediator is something that China is at risk, and internationally people see China as being on the Russian side, and so it's hard to see it succeeding. But SCO has been joined by India, so through SCO, if this issue is discussed, and to a certain degree, China can exert a certain degree of influence toward the solution of this problem. Well, I think that is what China would want to do, possibly. But the present situation is very fluid. So to what extent that would become reality is something I do not know. I'm sorry, I haven't given a proper answer to your question.
Thank you very much. And if I may repeat, we are accepting questions from the audience in chat section of YouTube. Please send your question together with your name and affiliation. Professor Inoue responded to questions, and as it was just mentioned, regarding the unification scenario of China, it seems that Professor Inoue thinks China pursues peaceful unification, and China repeatedly says this. But peaceful, the meaning of peaceful by China may be slightly different from peaceful that we understand. Direct landing operation and large size army landing in Taiwan. Excluding that, anything may be considered a peaceful unification. And what is conceivable is to apply military pressure on Taiwan. So the Taiwan will be conceding to pressure. And therefore, a peaceful unification concept has to be carefully considered. But current circumstances of China, and when we look at its position in international community, if we apply rational thinking, I don't think China is thinking of applying military power immediately. Global Development Initiative was proposed by Xi Jinping in the United Nations last year, and Global Development Initiative Friends Group was established. A group of friends of Global Development Initiative was established under the umbrella of the United Nations, with more than 100 countries becoming the members. And a Global Security Initiative was proposed by Xi Jinping this year in Boao Forum. So global governance is what China is focused on, and this shows that China wants to maintain influence, and China considers that it is able to vie effectively against the U.S. with its influence. So if we think rationally, it's not likely that China will be using military measures, but this is only when rational thinking is applied, and Taiwan issue may not solely be considered in that context. and China is concerned about the movements of the U.S. If the United States is deterred, then that might awaken the sense of resistance from Taiwan, and that may also lead to peaceful unification. But even without that, it will be easier for China to use military force. So between the U.S. and China, it seems that the two countries are out of sync, and I would like to pose a question to Professor Inoue. The U.S. and U.S. allies are looking at this change of status quo in Hong Kong and military pressure on Taiwan, and they are condemning these to China. But I don't think China is accepting this, listening to this seriously. I believe China believes China believes its actions are legitimate. The U.S. also does not accept that view of China. For China and the U.S., is it possible to align the perceptions mutually? And if there is anything that Japan can do in helping achieve this, what would that be? Professor Inoue, please.
Thank you. U.S. and China, to align the thinking between the two, is it possible? That's a very big question. And I cannot give a proper answer to this one either. I tend to be pessimistic. Now, what is meant by aligning awareness or recognition? It depends on this, but what the individual specific issues that might escalate and that might blow up on these issues, the United States and China, to try to manage these, I believe that is the image. And as to Japan's role in this, on this point, this is a very difficult question. When U.S.-China relationship is very bad, some people say Japan should intervene and mediate. But I think this depends on the issue. The security issue is such that it's not an issue of the kind that Japan can mediate in. But depending on the issue, Japan can play a role. What is difficult, on the other hand, is between Japan and China, there's very little communication at the moment. So the Japan-China communication is something that needs to be made more robust. Japan alone can't do this, but we need to ensure that there's more robust communication. That is all for me.
Thank you. Professor Takahara, please. Even within the United States, there are different views, and within Japan, there are different views. I think that is the reality. For example, the other day, when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, within the United States, well-known Taiwanese experts, there were, I believe, the majority opposed Speaker's visit, be it Ms. Pelosi or in Japan. There are people who argue that we should assume Taiwan contingency, and there are many commentators who speak of Taiwan contingency, but I think the main purpose is deterrence. And either view, those who agree with Pelosi's visit and those who disagree, I think the purpose is the same, which is to maintain peace in Taiwan Strait and to maintain the status quo in many sense surrounding Taiwan. And I think there are differences of views regarding the methodologies, and the borderline between provocation and deterrence is very sensitive. And where the line should be drawn, I think, is the source of disagreements. Same from China, the biggest issue is the independence movement in Taiwan growing in strength. If there is a growing movement for independence in Taiwan, China, since the days of Deng Xiaoping, says China has no other means but to invade Taiwan. So that it will not develop into that. To strengthen deterrence is the issue for China, and how that can be achieved. Seen from Japanese perspective, if seemingly extreme actions are taken by the U.S., then Japan should raise voice. But as I mentioned, within Japan there are many different views, and in the United States as well there are different views. So with some of the people in the U.S., we should work together to raise voices of concern.
Thank you very much. Professor Inoue mentioned that between the United States and China, it may be difficult to align their awareness and recognition. I subscribe to that view, and I believe that China sees it the same way. Traditional security is an area where this is clear. The United States, as Professor Takahara mentioned, would like to stop military power from being exercised in the region to protect safety and security in the region. That is the U.S. thinking. China does not prioritize this. Unification with Taiwan is the purpose for China. So between these two countries, to align awareness, I believe, is a very difficult thing to do. For this purpose, the two countries are trying to exercise deterrence for the different reasons. So within this context, China, in terms of nuclear strategy, strategic nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, I believe it has increased confidence in this area. So mutual decisive deterrence is mutual assured deterrence is what they're aiming for. So through conventional forces to attack China, attack the United States is what they're trying to do. To deter the United States through the use of conventional forces is what it's trying to do. So in preparation from the worst scenario, this is for the purpose of a deterrence for both countries. That would look like provocation. And so we need to exercise caution there. And lastly, shortly after this, the 20th Communist Party Congress will be held. That's the party Congress, which will be taking place. And the next 5-year structure will be defined as, and it was mentioned that Xi Jinping has no rival. It may be difficult to predict the nature of this, but going forward with regard to the Taiwan issue, based on the lessons it has learned from the Ukraine conflict, what policies or what attitudes may come out of China? You need not restrict yourselves to one. Respectively from Professor Inoue and Takahara, please. Professor Inoue, please.
So this is about the future, and it's difficult to comment, but assuming that according to majority view, in line with the majority view, if Xi Jinping assumes the third term, then basically the confrontation between the U.S. and China, I don't think, seen from the U.S. perspective as well, there is no factor that it will improve. So I believe we will have to assume that there will be tough stance that will continue. However, there will be attempts to continue dialogue so that there will be minimal stable relationship. And as we have already seen, with its economic power, China is strengthening relations with developing countries to increase its influence. And this is also another way to counter the U.S. And I believe these policies will likely remain unchanged. And Taiwan policy is quite a long-term policy for China. And even when there are changes in international situation, I don't think China's policy of unification of Taiwan will not change. Tensions will remain high for the short term, but I don't think there will be major change in its policy. Tensions may be continued, but I think China will continue to be cautious about unilateral military invasion.
Thank you very much. Professor Takahara, please. In China, the economic situation is becoming increasingly difficult, and recalling Deng Xiaoping, a peaceful international environment is important. I think that is what they're coming back to. And so in terms of policy, I think there'll be moderate policy. On the 26th, Xi Jinping made a speech, and I believe this will be the key tone of the Congress. And Taiwan Strait, peace and security to be protected is what has been said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The challenges for China posed by the Ukraine war, what lessons China learned? Under that topic, we've discussed the future of U.S.-China relations and China's Taiwan policy. This is not the end of this issue. Now that we have had this discussion, we will have to continue to pay attention to, and we also have to take into consideration domestic political situation in China. Thank you once again, Professor Inoue and Professor Takahara, and thank you for watching SPF China Observer. With this, we would like to conclude today's open forum. Thank you.
以上で笹川平和財団主催 SPF China Observer 公開フォーラムを終了いたします。
This is the end of SPF China Observer online open forum challenges for China posed by the Ukraine war. Thank you for watching.